So, welcome back for episode 30 of Mortal Realms Monday. This week we are taking a look at the Azyrite ruins that comes with issue 30 of the magazine. And I've gone ahead and assembled this fully, leaving off the planks on the top, and primed it with some grey sear. I'm now giving this a quick all-over coat of Death Guard green, just to get us started on that green undertone that the ruins are gonna have. This is pretty much the same way as the last ruins video. However, obviously on this one we've got the iron railings there, or the iron based windows, a slightly different technique to getting the same end result. So yeah, I'll get on with covering the ruins in this Death Guard green, and be back in just a bit, guys. Okay, so next up I'm taking a 50-50 mix of Loren Forest and Death Guard green, and I'm just going to give this a very light dry brushing over the bottom third of the ruins, just to darken up that base slightly. The effect I'm going for here is sort of a lighter top to the darker bottom, and obviously this is the way that I go about doing this. So as I said, just a very light dry brush. I say a light dry brush is a little bit of a heavy one, but you know, it's dry brushing all the same, just to get that darker bottom blending up into the Death Guard green there. So I'll get on with this and come back in just a sec. Right, and with that done, I'm now going to go the opposite way in tone, and I am taking a 50-50 mix of Wraithbone and Nurgling green, and obviously this part is going top down. So again, the top third, obviously concentrating a little bit more towards the top, and obviously the flat top of the ruins. And again, this is just trying to pick out those highlight edges. I will pull this down a little bit over some of the hard sharp edges towards the bottom there, just so that when I apply a wash later on, that will tone it all in together, but leave those sharper highlights. So the effect that I'm going for this is sort of that very old sort of musky green, sort of green washed stone look, rather than the grey type stone. Obviously I'm doing it this way to match in with the ruins that I did previously. So I'll get on with this and catch you guys in just a tick. And welcome back. Right, finally I'm just going over this, picking off those really sharp highlights up the top and then sort of down the statue with some Corax white. Now I'm not cleaning the brush at all between these different colours, so essentially the colours are slightly muddy and together, but that helps with a smoother blend, at least in my opinion, on getting, you know, from that darker green to those highlights. So again, I'll get on with this and be back in tick. Okay, so here I'm just mixing up a darker green wash. This is 2 parts Athonian Camo Shade, 1 part Agrax Earth Shade, and 1 part Lamian Medium. And I will actually throw into this a little bit of water as well, just to thin it down a little bit more when I do the rest of the model, as at this point I thought that it was a little bit too thick. It was staining the surface a little bit too much. Obviously the Agrax is just to take away some of that green tone and just to you know, brown it up a little bit. So obviously I'm going to apply this over all of the model, being sure to get it into those recesses, but not to let it pool up anywhere, and as this starts to dry, obviously gravity is going to make some of that wash run down and pool up at the bottom. So within the first sort of minute or so, I'll use the brush and just remove some of that pooling. Once that initial removal is done, there's pretty much nothing left to run. You'll notice here that I'm using just a bottle cap here. This is an Oasis drinks bottle cap, and what I've done is sprayed it with some grey cere, or any spray paint will be fine on the inside, and then I've just varnished that with some matte varnish. And I find that these little pots, or these little lids, make good little wash pots for making up small amounts of custom washes, you know, test batches and things like that, before I go and make them into you know, put it into larger pots. So just a little tip there for you guys. You know, drinks bottles, the wider the bigger the cap, the obviously more space you have to work with. But yeah, so I'll get on with this and be back in just a bit. Right, so now that the wash has fully dried, I'm now going to go back in with some Corax white and very lightly dry brush over the piece again. This is to bring out all those edge highlights, and there is sort of minimal paint on this. You can see as I start a little bit too much on there. I'd have some paper towel off to the side that I'm just sort of scrubbing on to remove the excess paint. But you can see here that I'm just, you know, pulling out those raised details and getting rid of some of that sort of greenish tone. But because this is dry brush, that green tone will show through it a little bit, giving us more of a green tinted grey rather than a harsh white. So again, I'll get on with this, and we'll come back in just a minute. Alright, and for the final highlight on this, concentrating it just on the top and a very light dusting, is some Ceramite white. Now obviously the Corax white has that slight grain tone to it. The Ceramite white is a lot purer, so it'll, you know, pick off those edges just a little bit more. And you can see now that that's pushed that green tone back, and we've got that sort of green working up from the bottom, and it gets lighter as we come towards the top of the stonework. And I do think that this gives the ruins a really nice finish. Okay, so with the ruins pretty much painted, I'm now going in with some Leadbelcher and just painting in all of these iron windows, I suppose you could call it. I'm not really sure what you would call these, but just all these sort of metal parts that are within the windows that surround the ruins here. And this point onwards, we're going to look at doing rust effects and painting sort of metal in general. So I'll get on with this, get the first coat on. This will take a couple of coats, as I'm not using a black base on the metal work. If you want to have a slightly darker look to it, then you could go in and prime this area with black first, obviously by brush, and then go over with the Leadbelcher afterwards. But I'll get on with this and catch you guys back in a flash. So nice and easy, this next part, straight from the pot, some non-oil. Now if you're one of those that's a little bit worried about taking from the pot because of knocking the pot over, then obviously go ahead and, you know, put some into a smaller container of some kind. But I'm confident enough that I won't spill it, even though I recently spilled half a pot of Druchii Violet, which I am now struggling to replace, as my local 3 Games Workshop retailers are out of stock. So I'm having to wait for a bit rather than order it online. But yeah, all this is doing is just going to darken up the metal. Obviously you want to try and get it to sink around each of those little bumps on the cross sections, as well as where those cross sections overlap each other. You want a little bit of shading on there as well. So not too much pooling, but, you know, Okay, so once that Nuln oil has had time to fully dry, I'd say about 15-20 minutes, I'm now taking some IronBreaker and I'm just giving this a dry brush pretty much over the sort of central area of this, just to pick off some of those edge highlights and sort of brighten the centre of the metal area up a little bit more, ready to apply the rust. I don't want to do a dry brush in after the rust, as that's going to pick on the rusted texture. So I have a little bit of a different technique for that. So I go in and add this dry brush highlight first, and then we can rust over the top of that. So again, catch you guys in a tick. Okay, now this is actually a new technique for me. It's a new product for me. I've not used this before, and this is Typhus Corrosion, obviously from Games Workshop Citadel range. Typically I would normally use a dark brown, maybe a Mornfang brown or something like that, and then stipple in some Skrag brown, and then something like Troll Slayer orange or something like that for the rust effect. Obviously this stuff has a sort of powder in there, like a grain, so when it dries it leaves a grainy texture. I'm applying it in the same way that I would if this was just regular paint, using a really battered up brush here that is good for stippling, but I do lather on a little bit more than I normally would, knowing that it's going to dry and evaporate slightly and leave some of that texture. Now I do also use this on the bottom of the ruins, and this is to represent splashed up mud, as though there's been a heavy downpour and some of that mud has splashed up off the ground. Obviously it's got some of that texture in there for those sort of larger grains of mud, and it just gives, it's another way that you could use this. It doesn't just have to be used for a rust effect. You can get a pretty decent mud effect, as you'll see here. Again, this is trial and error for me. Thankfully it did turn out pretty okay. I'm happy with it, but obviously you guys can see now how this will work out. So I'll get on with this, let it dry, and catch you guys in a bit. Right, so the recommended accompaniment to Typhus Corrosion is Ryza Rust. This is a dry paint from Citadel. Now I've not used dry paints before. As I said earlier, I'll usually do this with the same stippling brush, using Skrag brown and then some Troll Slayer orange over the top. But I thought I'll give new product a try, or a new product from me, give a new technique a try something new. So what I've done is dip some of this into the paint that's in the lid, sort of dabbed it off on some paper towel, almost to a dry brush point, and now I'm dry brushing it over the rusted areas, so anywhere that I had that Typhus Corrosion. What I will also do is get a little bit more paint on the brush and remove not so much of it, and then stipple it on into some smaller areas. And what this will do, as the dry brushing, obviously as you can see, has a bit more of a dull brown orange look to it, which it does look fine for me, but I find that stippling some of the sort of stronger pigment on the paint leaves a slightly brighter rust orange, which is what I would do with Troll Slayer, so it's kind of the equivalent to it. Impressions of this, it's another technique, it's another way of doing the same job. So yeah, I like my old way, and this way's okay too. If you haven't tried it before, give it a go and see what you think. But again, I'll get on with this and be back in a flash. Okay, so that's the iron finish there, and you can see where I stippled in some of that harsher or stronger orange, just to give a little bit more of a heavier rust tone, and I think it came out great. I'm now taking some Skrag brown and stippling this over the Ryza rust on the bottom, that mud effect. And the thinking behind this is wet mud tends to be darker, and the drier it gets, the lighter it gets. So I'm stippling this, leaving some of that wet mud nearer the ground, and then as it gets further up, it's going to get lighter and or drier, therefore lighter. So I'll stipple this Skrag brown over the top, dry brush it a little bit, and then go back over with some Zandri dust. Right, and so with that mud texture finished, I'm now taking some IronBreaker and a size 1 brush, and all I'm doing is just edge highlighting some of this metal, sort of the little bumps and things like that. What I'm not doing is highlighting right up to where the metal intersects or overlaps, as that area is not likely to get bashed about as much or knocked by things. This is to represent those areas where some of that rust has been chipped away back to that cleaner metal underneath, as rust usually tends to form on flat surfaces a little bit more than it does on sort of corners and things like that, where it can get knocked off easier. So the idea is just to go around, pick off all these edges and the bumps and that over all of the metal areas, and then we'll come back in just a bit. Now I am, before I go, I am stippling this in a few places, you know, coming onto some of those flat areas. This isn't pure, clean, straight edge highlighting. I want it to look a little bit chipped and worn away and, you know, rough edged. But for the most part, it's just an edge highlight with, you know, a little bit of a broken line or a little bit that comes into the flat area. Okay, so with the ruins now finished, I'm going in and adding some personal touches. This is something you can decide whether or not you want to do. And first of all, I'm going in with some Loren forest and my stippling brush, and just adding to where I want to place moss, focusing it around sort of flat areas, cracks, you know, places where moss will catch. This isn't going to be the full moss area. This is sort of that moss stain that you get before the moss actually fully grows, but it's a sort of a starting foundation for that growing moss. So I'm just going to apply this to a few areas that I want this, and I'll catch you guys in just a bit. Okay, so now I'm going to add the moss, and I read about this technique online. It's a slightly varied version of it, but essentially I'm taking some PVA glue and some modelling flock. I do believe the place that I read it mentioned using fine grit sand or something like that. But all I'm doing is mixing this into essentially a flock paste. I will add the flock until it starts to dry out too much. Then I would add a little bit more glue, get the amount that I want, add a little bit more flock to dry it out a little bit more, and then add some water just by dipping the brush into my water pot there, just to thin that PVA a little bit. So it's a little bit backwards and forwards, but what I'm looking for is sort of a slightly thinned down gunky pasty mess. And then what I'll do with this is apply this over the ruins where I want the moss. For the most part, it will be where I applied the Loren forest. Some areas may go away from that, and not all of the Loren forest will be covered with this. What this will do, as it dries, it will stay thick and clumped, as opposed to if you applied PVA glue and then sprinkled the flock on, which would then sit flat. This gives a lot more of a raised area for the moss, makes it look thicker and fuller, just like my hair. But no, it just gives a lot more texture and 3D look to it. On top of this, once it has dried, it then has a bit of a glossy look because of the PVA. So what I will do is, with some very thin down PVA, I will go back over these mossy areas, and it basically just add some more PVA glue over the top, and also sort of, because it's just pure PVA with water, there's no flock or anything in it, it's easier to do. I use a size 3 brush to do it. You can essentially paint in thin lines and streaks and things like that with the PVA mix, and then I will sprinkle flock over the top of all that. What that will do is that will lay flat in the areas where there was none of this clump moss underneath. It will obviously sit on top of the clump moss in the freshly applied PVA glue, which will then take away that gloss look because the glue will all be under the flock, and it also leaves that slightly fluffier moss texture to the model. So in my opinion, it just looks a little bit more realistic. You don't end up with flat moss everywhere. You end up with a bit of a build up, and you don't have that shiny PVA looking moss because you've got this cleaner moss over the top. So placement wise, like I said, this is mostly where I applied the Loren green. It's going to be anywhere where I think water could sit and moss would develop. Cracks, crevices, corners of pieces, some flat surface areas, and things like that, and then obviously where that moss would sort of climb and grow a little bit. Anyway, I'll get on with this. Obviously I'm just making up enough in the pot here for this portion. I do have to make up a couple more batches to cover the rest of the ruins, but I'll get on with this and we'll be back in just a flash. And there we have it, guys. Obviously with the top of the ruins there, I did exactly the same in terms of the stone as I did for the main ruins, and then the wood I did in the same way that I did in the previous video. So I felt there wasn't really, you know, any need to show that, just to save on time a little bit. But I do hope you enjoyed the video. I hope that some of what I've gone through with my techniques and experimentation is useful to you guys. If you did like it, please hit that thumbs up button. If you're not already subscribed, hit that subscribe button and ding that bell for notifications of when new videos go live. It is a pleasure making these videos for you guys. I do hope you are enjoying them. That's the end of today's one, and until next time, keep safe and keep painting those minis.